to Made by Lucy. Today I'm going to be showing you how to apply a buttonhole to your work using your sewing machine. So there's two ways that I'm going to show you how to do that today. The first is using a manual buttonhole foot, and I'm going to be showing you how to do that on my brother machine. These machines I use in the workshop for my beginner sewers, and they have a manual selection for your buttonhole hole up here. This is what I call a manual foot. I'm just going to zoom you in to show you where you would see that on your sewing machine. This selection here is your buttonhole for your manual machine. Okay, so that's your manual machine, and then I'm going to show you how to do it on an automatic machine, an electronic machine, and you can see the difference, and you can see what your machine does from home and follow along and learn how to do your buttonhole. Now, buttonholes are typically one of those scary sewing techniques that people worry about, but they're actually really simple once you get the hang of it with a little bit of practice, and they can really make your project or your garment look sort of really special and give that little added touch. So there's a few things you're going to need before you get started. First of all, you're going to need your machine with your thread that coordinates your fabric that you're using, and a full bobbin. Make sure you've got a full bobbin. We don't want to be running out halfway through our buttonhole. You're also going to need to change your machine foot here. So you need to take off the standard foot that you may be using, and you need to replace it with your buttonhole foot. Now, your buttonhole foot is going to look something like this. It's a long, slim foot with a moving middle here that slides up and down. You maybe have a space to put your button in the back, or this one is a manual one, so I'm going to measure my button size. So you need to place that onto your sewing machine. Now you need to make sure that when you place it on, you clip it onto the bar here, and the hole in front is where your needle will go down. So just make sure it's the right way round. If I show you on here what I'm doing, you can see the difference. So the right way round here, if I clip my buttonhole foot on this way round, you can see my needle is going to go down in this front section here. If I turn my buttonhole foot round to clip it on, you'll see here that my needle cannot go down. It's going to hit the actual buttonhole foot. So that's a telltale sign that you've got it on the right way or the wrong way round. My buttonhole foot on first of all, and then that's in place. Now you'll also notice when you apply your buttonhole foot that your top thread here that you normally clip underneath your sewing foot is hanging above. Don't worry, just pop that to the side and we'll hold that out as we start our buttonhole foot when we begin. So that's what you need for your machine: thread, full bobbin, and your buttonhole foot attached the right way round. I'm just going to move that aside. Now there's also a couple of other bits you need to prepare before you get going on a manual sewing machine. So on a manual sewing machine, you're going to need to estimate the size of your button or measure the size of your button before you begin sewing. The machine won't do that for you. So to do that, what we're going to need to do is measure our button onto our chosen fabric. So you get whatever it is you're sewing. So say it's a little purse, for instance, and you need to decide where your button is going to fall on that garment, on that project, and you just need to make a little dot. So say your button is going to fall here, you need to make sure you make a little dot in the centre where that button is going to go. So mark on your fabric where you want your button. Once you've done that, you then need to also mark the top and the bottom of the button the right way round. So for example, if you're making a shirt or a blouse, the buttonholes will lay vertically down the blouse. So make sure you measure the top and the bottom of the button. If you're doing a button on a pocket, for instance, you might have the buttonhole running horizontally, so you need to mark from left to right. So just make sure you're thinking on your project which way round you want your buttonhole to lay. So for example purposes, it doesn't overly matter on here. I'm just going to measure from left to right for you. And when you're measuring the top and bottom of your button, left to right, or up and down, you need to make two little marks using either a tailor's pencil or an invisible pen, one that's going to disappear, so that you don't see that once your buttonhole is finished. And you need to leave a little gap, a tiny gap, about 1 millimetre above and below, and that just gets the button through with ease, and you're not forcing the button through the buttonhole. So if I just show you what I've done there. So I've popped my button where I would like it, and then I've put a little mark above and a little mark below. It almost looks a bit bigger there, but it's literally 1 millimetre, not even that, below and above, to give a little bit of room to put my buttonhole through. So once I've done that, I can then take that away, and I've got the size of my buttonhole. So this is where I need to stitch from and to, and then from and to the other side as well. So that gives me my guide. So once you've done that, you are literally ready to go. Just a little note before we have a practice. If you were sewing a garment that had a row of buttons, so for instance a blouse or a shirt, you would need to mark all of your buttonholes in, measure them all into place, space them out equally before you begin sewing. It's really important to get a really nice clean buttonhole line, make sure they're all spaced out before you start. So you would make all your markings going down your work before you begin. So let's move on to the actual sewing. The next thing I also need to do is make sure that my sewing machine is set on the buttonhole option. So on this particular machine, you will see there are 3 options for the buttonhole here, and they're all labelled A, B, C and D. You may have 1, 2, 3 and 4. And this will tell you manually where you need to start and where you need to finish. So as this is a manual machine, you need to move the settings as you sew the buttonhole. So for instance, you start on A, which is this one here. So you just keep the guide on number A, and that will sew across the top or bottom of your buttonhole. And then you will stop and you will move the selector to B. The B will then sew up the buttonhole or down the buttonhole. Then you will stop once you get to your bottom point. So that's the length of your buttonhole, and then you'll change it back to C again. That will sew across the bottom, you'll stop, and then you'll go to D, which will go back up or back down and join back up to the top or bottom. And that should give you your buttonhole shape ready to cut the middle out. So we need to make sure we put our selector to start on A. Another word to note as well, it's really good to refer to your manual. This is a really simple machine. This machine selects the width and length of your stitch for you. When you begin to sew, you can adjust that, but you don't need to. It's already set on default. So you literally just change your selector here to the different letters. Your machine, you may need to adjust the stitch length. Sometimes you have a little wheel up here, or you might have another wheel on the front here, which is your stitch width and length. You may need to adjust that, so always refer to your manual to double check before you begin. Okay, so I've got my buttonhole selector now set to A. This is to start my buttonhole off. Just another note before we begin, you need to decide where you're going to lay your fabric in your machine. So whether your machine is going to sew from front to back, from bottom to top of your buttonhole, or the other way around. Now on my dial here, it has little arrows. It tells me what direction it's going to sew. So once I've done A, the top bit or the bottom bit, I'm then going to turn it to B, and my B is going to sew from the bottom backwards. So I need to make sure that my fabric is set in my machine to begin at the bottom of that fabric, so my bottom notch down here, and it's going to sew back up to the top one. So that's just another little note to double check before you begin. Okay, so then we are pretty much ready to go. You also need to just make sure your buttonhole foot is pushed all the way back. You don't want it forward, all the way back, because as it sews, it moves that buttonhole foot down. So push that back as far as it will go. Make sure you're starting on the right mark. So we've just looked at mine, and I need to start on the bottom mark because it sews from bottom to back, from front to back. So I'm just going to now line that first mark up with the little hole in the front of my buttonhole foot just here. Let me just show you what I've done. Hopefully you can see there, I've got a little pink mark in this little hole at the front here. That's my bottom mark, and that's where I'm going to begin my buttonhole. And then we need to begin sewing. So this is a manual foot, so it won't stop automatically. You need to tell it when to stop by taking your foot off the pedal. So this first one we do, which is A, this is just going to do the bottom of our buttonhole, so that little sort of overstitched part at the bottom to secure your hole and stop it unravelling. And you need to go back and forth on that about 5 or 6 times just to make sure that that stitch line is going to hold. So I'll just show you that here. I'm just holding this top thread just gently out the way before I begin sewing. There you go. So I literally have just sewn back and forth a few times. and then you want to end with your needle up out of the fabric. So let me just show you what the machine has done now. So in there you can just about see I've now got a nice stitch line across, a nice zigzag stitching going across back and forth. So next we're going to do the next selector. So my needle is up, I'm going to change this now to B, and this is going to sew backwards along my work, and that's going to do the left hand side of my buttonhole. So with this I need to stop when I see that new mark, that top mark, hit this center window here in my buttonhole foot. So I sew up this side and I keep going until I can see that mark I've made, which is my top guide where my buttonhole needs to finish. So I'll just show you how far I've gone and hopefully you can see my mark. So if you can see, I've sewn from the bottom here all the way up, and up the top here you can just about see my little pink mark that I've made with my pencil, and that's where I've stopped, and that's my buttonhole size. So again, you need to make sure your needle now is up out of your fabric, ready to change your selector. We're going back to C now, and that's going to stitch across the top here. So again, just a few going across. It does it in one place for you. And you want to have your needle finishing on the right hand side now, because we're going to be going down this right hand side. So needle up, and then we're going to change it to D. And then we're just going to come down that right hand side, all the way to that bottom mark we've first done. And then you can needle up, go back to A, and I just finish it off again with a few more. Needle up, and then we can lift our buttonhole out of our fabric. There we are, just gently move it out, and there you have it. Ta-da! Your first buttonhole. So what you need to do now is open that center point up so you can fit your buttonhole through, and what you'll need is a seam unripper to do this, or a really sharp pair of scissors, or you can get a special buttonhole tool like a little chisel that you can use to open that up. I'm going to show you how to do that at the end, once I've shown you how to sew on an automatic machine. So it's worth having a practice at doing these a few times to get it right, and also have a practice on the type of fabric you're actually using for your project. This can make a difference as well. If your fabric is quite thin, it's quite lightweight, you might want to put an interfacing on the reverse of your fabric before you start your buttonhole, just to give it a bit of extra strength and stability before you begin sewing. You can buy interfacing, which is almost like a papery sort of fabric. You can buy an iron-on interfacing. You iron onto the reverse of your fabrics before you begin. Okay, so now I'm going to show you how to do your buttonhole if you've got an automatic buttonhole foot on your machine. So I'm going to show you how to do this on my Toyota machine that I use regularly in my workshops here. So this machine, as you can see, is an electronic machine. It's got an electronic stitch selector at the top here, where I choose what type of stitches I want to do, and I choose my width and length of my stitch. So on here I choose my buttonhole foot stitch, which is number 48, and I also need to choose my stitch width and my stitch length. So this is the width of the zigzags and how far apart those zigzags will fall. So again, refer to your manual if you need advice on that. It will tell you what the preferred length and width are for your particular machine if you need to choose that. So I've set mine up ready to go on my stitch length and width, and they all vary slightly, so definitely refer to your manual. And then very similarly, I've got a buttonhole foot, which looks like this, is slightly different than our last one. And this particular one gauges the buttonhole size for you automatically, because it does it automatic. So what this little piece that goes up and down here is where you put your button into. So for instance, this yellow button that we were using, I would open up this top piece of my buttonhole foot, it slides up, and I would just sit my button in there snugly so it can't move. And then my machine knows how big to make that buttonhole from that little guide up there. So that's the automatic bit. So it does really make your life a lot easier. But they both work, you know, exactly the same. This then needs to go onto my machine. So again, you need to make sure it goes the right way round. Now, if you've got one of these, the button goes to the back of your machine, and then your needle will go through this little needle guide here. So you need to clip this onto your machine. So remove your standard foot that you may have on your machine. So take that one off, and then just slide your buttonhole foot under and clip it onto the bar. Now on this particular one, I need to again push my buttonhole foot all the way back, because it starts from this bottom one and it sews backwards. So it starts from the bottom of your buttonhole up to the top, across, and then back down, exactly as it did on the other one. My thread still is sat up here out the way, so I'm just going to hold that gently out of the way. And on this particular machine, the difference, so it needs to be able to know when to stop. So it has two little guides here that will tell it how wide the buttonhole needs to be. And it knows that from this button that's put in the back. But I also have a little lever up here, which I need to pull down. And this lever sits behind this front notch here, so it can't come forward. And then what we'll do when it sews, this lever will then go back and it will hit that top, that back lever there, and then that guide, and then it will stop and then do the rest of the buttonhole. So you pull that down, make sure it's sat behind this front guide here, and then you're ready to go. So now I've done that, I'm going to lift my foot up so I can get my fabric underneath. Again, you would have marked on your fabric where you want your buttonhole positioned on your garment or your project, and you need to be sewing from the bottom. Let me just show you. You need to be sewing from the bottom. So if your button, the middle of your button was falling here, you need to measure the bottom of your buttonhole, and that's where you start from. So on these machines, that's the only mark you really need to make, because it does the rest for you. So you then need to get that mark that you've made the bottom in the little hole here, the needle hole here, so you can see it, so you know where you're starting. Holding your thread up out the way, and then you'll see this one works slightly different. So on my automatic buttonhole, and again they all vary slightly, even the automatic ones, mine does like a box shape first and then it goes back over with the zigzag, but you'll be able to see when I begin sewing. Okay, so I'm just going to put my foot on the pedal and hopefully it should do it for me. And with the automatic buttonhole foot, you can see it stops at the top and comes back down. All you're doing is really sort of keeping the fabric in line. It's going back up again. And then it's coming back down with the zigzag. And my foot is staying on the pedal, on the foot pedal. I haven't lifted it. I haven't had to stop. It just does the whole thing for me. Just coming down to the finish now. And then it will finish off. Needle is up, and then you just lift your work out, and there you have your finished buttonhole. So you can see the difference there. It does it all for you. You don't need to stop and change the stitch and start again. It just sort of does from start to finish for you. But both ways equally, you know, make a finished buttonhole. So whatever machine you've got, you're going to be able to make a satisfactory buttonhole. Again, the same applies if you're using thin fabric or sort of lightweight fabric. You might want to put an interfacing behind that to make sure it's nice and stable. That applies for both machines. Okay, so now we've sewn our buttonhole. Have a good practice. Practice on a few different fabrics as well so you get the hang of it. Refer to your manual if you need to. Now we need to open this buttonhole up so that we can get our button through. So as you can see, the fabric in the middle there is still sealed tight shut. A couple of ways to do this. You can snip through there with scissors. You can buy a special buttonhole like chisel if you want to, or what I like to use is my seam unripper and a pin. So what you need to do is you need to pop your pin in your buttonhole away from your top sewn section. So you need to put your pin through your fabric like that, below those top stitches, a little way below those top stitches, and that protects your seam and ripper from ripping through those top stitches. You then want to put your seam and ripper, push it through from this inside of this bottom row of stitches here, so push it into the middle like so, with your little bobbly bit poking up, and then really gently cut in a straight line through the center of your buttonhole, right the way up to that knee pin. The pin will stop it from going any further, so that protects those top row of stitches. And there you go, there's your buttonhole. Now don't worry if you've got these little fray bits, you can trim them gently, but they will disappear in time over use, so don't panic. And then your button should slide through your buttonhole. And there you have it. That's how you do your buttonholes. Don't worry about it, have a good practice and you'll be well away.